right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second episode of Let's Talk About Shh. So, this is a podcast all about exploring. Sorry, I'm just muting my phone here. Exploring sexuality and sexual health and relationships and love and intimacy and all that good stuff. And every day we're going to explore a different topic and a different idea relating to all of that. The goal is that, we can deepen our understanding about sexuality and how it impacts our lives and our human connections. So this is a live broadcast. We are expecting, or we are not expecting, well, hopefully expecting, but we are accepting live call-ins, and we're going to put that number up really shortly. I've decided that each day we're going to talk about a specific topic. So the topic for today is going to be a deep dive into consent. Once again, feel free to call in with your questions or your comments or your stories. If you have any success tips, any stories you want to share about things that worked out really well for you or went really great, or advice you want to offer other people. So that's what we're all about here. Okay, so who am I? My name is Tila. I am a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. I have been doing sex ed for a number of years now. It's my passion. I love talking about sex. I love talking about sex ed. I love helping people connect with that part of themselves. And a lot of people say that I make it really easy to talk about, which is great, because I think that it should be easy to talk about, Sex is fun. Why shouldn't learning about it be? Why shouldn't talking about it be? Why do we have to have all this baggage around it? So part of this podcast is really about reducing those barriers and reducing that embarrassment and getting into the nitty-gritty and getting your questions answered, okay? So I love to encourage people to comment. Please comment your thoughts if you don't want to call in, or if you have a thought about something that somebody else has said, or if somebody's calling in for advice, feel free to chime in. I just have a couple of things. I really want to build a positive community. We're about reducing barriers, reducing negativity around sex. So we want to try and keep this a nice positive space for everybody who joins us. So when you're posting your comment, just sort of think to yourself, is this true? Is this helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Okay. I know it can be fun to, post all those negative comments and pick fights with people online, and, people love to troll, and it's a pastime, I guess, for some people, but that's not the kind of vibe we're trying to go for here. We want to create a nice supportive community where everybody can feel good about joining, and there's no such thing as a bad question. So please don't shame people for their questions. People have all kinds of different experiences and education levels. There's no such thing as a bad question. And I've heard all kinds of questions about sex and relationships, and there's no such thing as, a stupid question when it comes to this, because there's so many people out there who have the wrong information. So it's about getting that right information out there. All right, so we are going to open up the phone lines. So if you want to call in, if you want to chat about a problem that you're having, get some one-to-one relationship coaching, or if you have a thought about something that I'm going to talk about today, or maybe you have a wonderful success story or a success tip for relationships or sex that you want to share with somebody else, awesome. Call in and share those stories, okay? In the meantime, as I mentioned, we are going to chat a little bit about consent today. Now, consent is a super important topic. And as we go on and things just get more and more relevant as far as this goes. And it's a passion topic of mine. I think obviously consent is really important. I wrote a whole book about it called Got Consent. You can check it out on my website. But the interesting thing about consent is that a lot of people will say that they know what consent is, and a lot of the time they can actually accurately define what it is too. But the funny thing is that even when people can accurately define it and they actually, give a good definition and everything, when they're given real world examples, and they're asked like, oh, well, how should consent play out in this situation? Most people actually get it wrong. They end up falling back on what cultural standards are. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of cultural standards really don't support consent. It's actually goes against a lot of the concepts of consent. So while I know it may not sound like super exciting, you're probably like, oh great, she's going to talk about consent now. I know what that is. Even if you think you know what it is, like, I'm not saying that you don't, but you can always learn more. As an educator and someone who wrote a book about it, I'm still learning more about consent, where there's so much changing with the conversation. So I want to kind of start with giving a basic definition of what consent is, and we'll go from there. And then we're going to talk about some of what people usually refer to as the gray areas, where things get a little bit muddy and people all of a sudden aren't so sure anymore. So, consent, in its simplest form, can just be defined as desire. Your desire to do something. You're giving your permission to do something based on wanting to. And a lot of people feel that that definition is pretty good. However, it doesn't really cover everything. There's a lot more to it than that. I mean, people consent to sex sometimes even when they don't want to, but they're still consenting, right? That doesn't necessarily make it wrong. So there's an anagram. I'm sure you've probably seen it floating around on the internet. If you follow my Facebook or my Instagram or my LinkedIn or any of my social media accounts, I'm sure you've seen me post about it too. Or if you've picked up my book, I've talked about it in my book as well, but it's the FRIES acronym. And FRIES stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Okay? Now these are all the elements that we want to be present for consent to be, well observed, right? So freely given, that's an easier one for people to understand. It's the idea that someone is consenting without, threats or coercion or anything influencing their decision. Their decision isn't based off of, somebody telling them, oh, well, if you don't agree to this, then I'm going to, or they're not thinking, if I don't agree to this, then I'm not going to get that thing, or, So it's really about being able to make the choice of your own accord without that choice impacting other areas of your life. Okay? We see this a lot when we're talking about power dynamics. Power dynamics change things a lot, and that's where that freely given part sort of comes into play. Hey, Amanda. Slightly garbly. Oh no, no more sound issues. That's not good. Maybe I'll try turning this down a little bit. Okay, hopefully that fixes the issue. No more garbly sound. Might be because I'm using a different microphone today. It's a little bit closer to my mouth because my earphones are sort of pressing it against my face. Any comments on the sound? No more comments on the sound right now. Okay. Well, I'm just going to keep going. So when we see a lot more about the freely given aspect of consent when we're looking at power dynamics and how that interplays. So the most common example, as I was about to get into, is when we're looking at employee-employer relationships. So if you have your boss and your boss has a lot of power over you because, they can influence your livelihood, they can impact your job, which, can impact how you live your life, they can make your work conditions really unpleasant, all of these things, all these ways that they have power over someone, right? So, okay, you're saying it might be the headphones. Your headphones, not my headphones? Okay. Well, we're just going to keep going. Nobody else is saying anything about sound. Thank you for that feedback. Always important. Definitely trying to keep an eye on those comments, so thanks, guys. We're talking about power dynamics. Sorry, lost my train of thought. So all these ways that somebody has power over your life can really influence how somebody's choice to impact or somebody's choice to engage in something. And that is something that a lot of people who historically have had the privilege of a lot of power, whether it's being, a boss, whether it's having, different types of privilege is that if they've never encountered that kind of situation, it'd be a little bit more difficult to understand. A lot of the times that we don't understand something, it's usually because we haven't experienced it firsthand and we don't have any basis for how it would feel. So, it doesn't necessarily automatically make people bad people. It's just they've never had to experience it. They've never had to call it into question. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, unless we have a reason to, explore that, most of us don't. It's just the sad reality of people. So, except for you guys, because you were here on this live learning about consent like rock stars. Anyway, so that's the freely given piece. Reversible is not what most people think. Now, the big conversation that sort of comes in with reversible is that they're like, oh, well, if consent's reversible, then somebody could just say, consent to something and then like 2 weeks later say that they didn't consent to it. That's not really how reversible works. Consent is reversible in the future. It can always, 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 always be withdrawn. Even in the middle of something, like you could decide, hey, yeah, I'm totally into this, get into a sexual activity, find out it's not working for you for some reason. Maybe you're not feeling it. Maybe you're feeling a little sick. Maybe, whatever's happening just isn't working for you. Maybe you wander into a bad headspace for some reason. You can always withdraw that consent. It's not always fun for the other person, and you definitely want to have like some conversation there. You don't have to explain, definitely, unless you want to. But the other person may be wondering what happened. So just as a heads up for that. But the point is it can always be withdrawn. Consent can never be retroactively withdrawn. You can't take something back after it's already finished. You know what I mean? So there's a difference between reversible and withdrawn. And I think that the terminology people get a little hung up on in this is that they think that consent can be taken back after the fact. And it can't. It's always extending into the future, not what's already happened. In the cases where people are saying that, consent, I didn't consent to that, it then becomes the question is whether or not they consented in the first place. It's not whether or not the consent can be withdrawn. It's why are they saying they didn't consent? What is coming up? Did they actually consent? Was there a conversation about consent? Did they initiate that sort of thing? I mean, and that sort of becomes the question. And, was there consent at the time? Was it coerced? Was it freely given or wasn't it? Because that can make a big difference, right? So a lot of the times when somebody's saying after the fact that consent wasn't happening or it didn't happen, there's more to that story. It's not just they're changing their story. I mean, I'm not going to say no one does that. I'm sure some people do, which is unfortunate because it makes it a lot muddier and horrible for people who actually were coerced into consent or didn't actually consent and the other person didn't understand that. So that's a main issue. I just sort of want to talk about the whole reversible bit. So the other thing, the next in the acronym is informed. So consent should be informed. So what does that mean? Well, you should know what you're doing. You should know what you're getting into. You should know all the factors that should or that could influence your decision, Some people don't want to have one-night stands. Some people don't want to get into a relationship, right? So when you're consenting to sex, you kind of want to know, like, is this a one-time thing? Is this going to be an ongoing thing? Because that kind of information could influence your decision. The other thing, too, is, like, things around sexual health, like somebody might be interested in having sex, but what if it's not protected sex, right? Are they still consenting to it? Yeah, probably not, if they're very concerned about protecting their sexual health. So things like that can make a big difference for influencing that choice. And that's why choices being informed are super important, right? So yeah, I mean, the next one is enthusiastic, which I think is probably the easiest one for people to understand. And, that's that, like, would you rather have somebody be kind of like, oh, do you want to have sex? And then be like, or would you rather hear, like, hell yeah, or, something a little bit more, like, less PC. But you want people to be enthusiastic. You want them to want to participate. I mean, who wants to have sex with somebody who doesn't want to have sex with you? Like, that sounds awful. And I think that, most people would feel awful about that kind of sex, right? It's not going to make you feel desirable or good. And I mean, if your partner doesn't want to be there, then it's probably going to be really bad sex. I know some people say bad sex is better than no sex, but I kind of disagree. Anyway, so the last acronym in FRIES is S for specific. And this sort of ties a little bit into the informed piece, but it's sort of being about specific about what things you're consenting to. It's not enough to know, people have different ideas about what sex is, and that comes from, all sorts of things like from previous experience and cultural backgrounds and, preconceived notions, sometimes religion, spirituality, all figures into what people think sex is and what acts contribute to, what's a normal sexual activity look like, and that's going to change from person to person. So part of that specific piece is knowing what you're consenting to. If somebody says, hey, do you want to go have sex? And for you, sex is maybe like a combination of oral sex and vaginal sex, for example. But maybe for this other person, sex constitutes like anal sex and oral sex, or maybe for them, what their normal is lots of toys or kinky activities, or maybe it's more than one person, so having that specific information is pretty important, because that, once again, that can kind of influence your decision. And it's important that you have established with this prospective partner what you are and are not okay with. So now that we've kind of gone through a super detailed definition of what consent is, I think that most people would agree that consent is pretty important. However, not even, like I said, even those people who agree that consent is important and can define what it is often aren't able to apply it to the real world. And all the things that get in the way are those cultural norms, which we've already sort of talked about, are not exactly creating a consent culture or best practices for consent. And the challenging thing about this is that we're in sort of a weird transitionary time where people are having more and more and more conversations about consent, but there's still a lot of people that haven't learned about it, haven't talked about it, haven't thought about it, and are relying on those cultural cues that we learn from the media and from high school and porn and teen magazines, which are not good educational pieces. They can be entertaining and they can be fun, but they're not educational pieces, and they're not good models for us. They don't help us create healthy relationships. And so when we rely on those scripts, you can sort of, there's a disconnect when somebody who is interested in following consent best practices and someone who's relying on those scripts. I've read a lot of studies with young men who've been taught consent and have become huge consent advocates who have been laughed at. I should mention they're heterosexual cisgendered men who have been laughed at by female partners when they've tried to follow consent guidelines. So, I mean, everybody needs to learn about consent and everybody needs to practice it. Some people still feel that it's just sexier to take action. And the thing I always say to them is, why risk it? Consent is not only a way of ensuring that your partner wants to be there and that they're into what you're doing, but it's actually pretty sexy in itself. It's a lot of people have started seeing consent more in the light of foreplay. You can use consent to engage in all kinds of dirty talking, talk about fantasies and things you want to do with that person. And that gives them a chance to, say, oh, yeah, that sounds really good, or maybe not. And so stuff like that is pretty important. It's also pretty affirming as well. Like if you say to somebody, hey, Can I kiss you? Or can I take your shirt off? Or, can I go down on you? Or whatever activity that you're suggesting. And they get all shy and awkward and quiet. It's usually a good indication that, maybe they're not into it or there's something wrong. And that's a good cue to take a time out or to take a step back or to find out what's going on. Because ultimately, you want somebody to be like, yeah, that sounds really good. You want someone to want you back. It's way more exciting when both people are into it, and it actually can make for a lot more, not just intense sex, but emotionally connected, because you feel like you're really connecting with your partner because you've had that communication. There's sort of this prevailing notion in, Hollywood that it's sexier to just take action, like lovers should just know what we want and just go for it. And there's so many stories from sexual assault survivors and sexual assault perpetrators that's what they did. They just went for it. And it wasn't welcome, and it caused big problems, and, lives were ruined. People, sexual assault can cause some severe PTSD. People can end up in jail, it's all because they didn't ask or they didn't check in. It just seems kind of silly. Like, why have all that pain and trauma? Because it's just sexier to go for it. That doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense in the grand scheme of things. And, I know one of the other major objections I run into when talking to people about consent is that they're afraid that, asking is going to, ruin the mood. And the reality is, if asking is ruining the mood, you were literally the only person in the mood. Okay? And if the other person is super into it, but maybe they're super bashful, and maybe they are, maybe they're just really embarrassed in talking about sex, and that's why it ruins the mood, then, there's another conversation too, because I'm a big advocate. If you can't talk about sex, if you can't talk about your desires, I don't know if you're really in a place that you should be doing them. Connecting with someone else on that kind of intimate level, it's not just about opening yourself up to vulnerability, but the other person's making you vulnerable, making themselves vulnerable to you too. So, if you're not in a place of emotional maturity where you feel you can handle that, if you can't even talk about it happening, then it might be a good indication that you're not ready to be engaging those kind of behaviors, right? So it's just something to sort of think about in terms of, choosing to engage in the conversation, right? We need to stop treating sex like it's something we can't talk about. We can talk about it, and we should be talking about it, and we should be talking about consent. And, all of those things are really important, right? And if that's just too embarrassing for you, then that's maybe some inner work you need to do. It's something you need to read more about consent, read more about sex, confront why you might have that embarrassment. For anybody who's struggling with those kind of questions for themselves, I actually do have some information on my website. I have a couple articles about sexual embarrassment. Feel free to go check them out. They actually have some suggestions on how you can start getting to the bottom of what is causing your embarrassment and work through that. Because the more embarrassed you are about sex too, the more it's actually going to ruin your enjoyment, the more comfortable and secure we feel in ourselves and our bodies and our own sexuality, the better sex we're going to have, right? So if you want to have really great sex, learn about it, talk about it, engage with the material, engage with yourself. It's going to make a world of difference. A lot of people that I talk to, when I'm talking to them about the challenges they face with their partner or, frustrations that they're having in the bedroom, so much of it can be resolved by good communication. And one of the first things I usually end up asking someone is, hey, did you talk to your partner about this? Have you talked to them about it? And in 90% of the answers I get back are no, I haven't. I'm not sure, how are things going to change if you can't talk to your partner about it, right? It's a little off topic from consent, but communication, super important. Anyway, so getting back onto the topic of consent. So, part of creating that consent culture is also, encouraging other people to use consent and also practicing it yourself. There's lots of different ways that we can ask for consent and talk about consent and get consent. The most straightforward and direct, obviously, is the verbal, do you consent? But there's lots of other ways you can ask it too, if that feels a little clunky to you. You can always ask things like, hey, do you want to have sex? Do you want to engage in, insert sexual activity here? Sorry, my throat's a little dry. You can also do things like, ask like, is this good for you? If you're not sure about whether or not they like this particular activity, you can always, and it's maybe not in the moment, you can always ask about things they've enjoyed in the past, whether with you or with someone else. There's lots of little ways to get an understanding of what sort of activities people are into, and that all plays into consent as well. So there's lots of different ways you can have this conversation. And one of the things I know people like to sort of do as well is play hard to get. And, it's kind of a fun game, and as they often say, protestation is part of the game. So sometimes saying no is fun, and being pursued is fun because it makes you feel desirable and it makes you feel sexy. And some people really like that. And I personally don't think that there's anything wrong with playing hard to get, but there's something really important part and piece of that is that everybody knows that you're playing. You can't play a game if you're the only one playing. It's not fair, and two, it's not really the way. It sort of strings people along in a way that's not fun for anybody else. So it absolutely can be a fun game, but you got to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So, if you're going to play hard to get, then make sure that the other person knows you're playing. Make sure that it's either a pre-established. I want to say ritual. That's maybe not the right word, but a lot of couples will develop their own language in their relationship. Certain phrasing like. I don't know, it's hard to think of an example off the top of my head, but you know what I mean? Like they develop their own language for their relationship. And, using those sort of cues to establish when that game is starting can be an effective way. If it's somebody you don't really know, I would not recommend playing hard to get because all you're really doing is kind of, well, let's be honest and brutal here. All you're doing is neglecting consent. When you're playing hard to get. It's not contributing to a consent culture, and you're sending people mixed signals that they should just pursue even though they don't even know if you're interested, which may be fine for you, but perhaps for the next person, if they do the same action and that person actually isn't interested and just kind of wants this person to leave them alone, it's really creating a lot of problems. And we see that a lot with a lot of stalking cases actually start off as innocent pursuit, not taking no for an answer, continuing to pursue somebody because it's the romantic thing to do. What's romantic is listening to what people say and what they want. And if people can't say what they want, maybe this isn't the right person for you. Or like I said, you should pre-establish that. If it's going to be a guessing game, make sure everybody knows it's a guessing game and that it's a game, unfortunately, research actually shows that about 4 out of 10 women still play hard to get. That's 4 out of 10 heterosexual cisgendered women that this study was done with, and 4 out of 10 say that they like to play hard to get, which is not good odds for a lot of men. And that's unfortunate. And I think if you're a gentleman listening in on this call and you're interested in the ladies, word to the wise is, if a girl's playing hard to get, don't play. Or if you think she's playing hard to get, don't play. That's my best advice to you, because there's a 6 in 10 chance that she's just trying to be polite and is not actually interested, and only a 4 in 10 chance that she's playing hard to get. And I think it's probably safer just to assume that, if she's actually interested, that she'll come back around. And, who wants to play those kind of games anyway when you don't know, So, yeah, I would walk away from that one. The other thing, too, is that if you're interested with someone and they're sending mixed signals like that, leave the next move up to them. If they don't make the next move, then they either weren't interested or they were waiting for you to. And like I said, that's not a good gamble to make. You should want somebody that wants to be with you and is interested in being with you. And I think a lot of the games that people play represent a lot of challenges, and they cause a lot of problems. You see this a lot in hookup culture, where, it's sort of like that people randomly hook up, and then, there's that, after period where, you can't text too soon, because if you text too soon, or if you show too much emotion too soon, you kind of, lose the game because you're more invested, or you show that you're more invested. It's a lot of games that people play in dating, and a lot of people actually feel super frustrated by it. And it's not really particularly helpful. Most people feel very frustrated and alone when they're doing casual dating and hookup culture. And studies actually indicate that about, I can't remember exactly, I think it was somewhere between 70 to 80%, I don't remember the exact number, but 70 to 80% of people who have participated in hookup culture actually didn't like it. They found the sex less satisfying. They found communication and consent particularly difficult to navigate, and they were highly frustrated by a lot of the games. I'm not going to go too far into that, because we're going to talk a little bit about hookup culture and how it's going to be changed with COVID and all the things that are happening in the world today. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about that tomorrow, so preview for tomorrow. So I don't want to go too far into it today, but there is that challenge in communication, right? So I kind of got on the whole hookup culture thing, and I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit. Anyway, so having that clear communication with consent is pretty important. And like I said, if you find that somebody's sort of playing, take a step back, wait for them to make the next move. If they're really interested, they will. If they're not interested and, they continue to play games or they walk away disappointed, that's not really your fault. It is not your job to fulfill somebody else's game fantasies that way. And if they can't be honest with themselves and honest with you, how honest are they going to be in a relationship or in whatever interaction you're intending to have with them? So, it's a good way of avoiding trouble. One of the things I always say when people are interested in learning more about consent is some good cultures to look at. I'm not going to say they practice consent perfectly, because what culture or subculture ever does, I have yet to see one that practices it perfectly all the time, because at the end of the day, people are valuable. But more often than not, good examples of consent can actually be found in BDSM culture. BDSM and kink culture, and a fair bit in polyculture as well. Mostly because there's a lot more open communication and a lot more back and forth about ideas and what sort of activities you want to engage in and all that kind of stuff. So there's different ways that those communities talk about consent as well. So I thought we'd just sort of go over a little bit about that terminology. Now, before we go into it too far, for anyone who's not super familiar with BDSM and kink, your point of reference is probably pop culture, most likely 50 Shades of Grey. I will not go on a rant about how much I dislike that franchise, mostly because it is extremely problematic. So there's a lot more to consent than is what you... There's a lot more to consent in those cultures than is what is typically seen and represented in pop culture. So that's an important thing to know. So, as with anything, dig a little deeper, go in learn a little bit more. Don't just assume you know it all. Nobody knows it all. Even I don't know it all, and I teach consent classes. So, yeah. So anyway, so getting into BDSM and kink cultures. So there's a couple different theories of consent or ways that people talk about consent. Bye, Amanda. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for commenting, and we'll see you tomorrow, where we talk about hookup culture. So, talking about BDSM, like I said, they have a couple different ways that they talk about consent and a couple different concepts. And the most common one that you'll run into, it's been around for quite a long time, is the concept of safe, sane, and consensual. And this is sort of a principle that is looking at mostly, traditionally, when it first was talked about more, is looking more at BDSM kink activities and understanding if your partner wants to participate in those and whether or not that falls into the category of safe, sane, and consensual. So what do those things mean? What does that phrase even mean? So it sort of breaks consent down by looking at whether or not a particular activity is safe and whether or not it's being done in a safe way. Now, with lots of BDSM activities, there's things that can go wrong and things that can go awry quite easily. For those of you that don't know, the leading cause of death during sex is actually asphyxiation, where a partner temporarily chokes or cuts off the air supply to their partner in order to deliver an extra thrill or an extra high during sex. That is the leading cause of death during sex because people often will go about it in an unsafe manner. They'll use things that will to effectively cut off the air supply. Like, I guess the most common one is usually some sort of string or rope that is used around the neck, which can actually be tightened too far. And it doesn't take much. It's in that particular example using asphyxiation, it's after 30 to 45 seconds, I believe it is. Don't quote me on the time, but it's a very short duration of time. There's brain damage, and then within a few minutes, brain death, right? So it doesn't take long, and people don't always engage in it in the safest fashion. So that's the whole sort of safe piece. So if you're doing an activity, have you done the research? Is it being done in a safe fashion? Do you have an exit strategy if things go wrong? The second qualifier is sane. This is sort of follows the safe thing, like how far are you going? Is it in your comfort zone? Is it something that you consider sane? Is it something you consider within the realm of your comfort zone? Is it completely out there and crazy? So that's a pretty straightforward one. And then the consensual is where they tie in that consent piece. Do you agree to the activities? Okay. Now, there's another phrase commonly used in BDSM kink communities, a little less well known and emerging in the last couple of years, is risk-aware consensual kink, which is shortened to the acronym RAC. So risk-aware consensual kink is a little bit different because it acknowledges that all forms of kink have a degree of risk, and it's about deciding what level of risk you're comfortable with. The other thing too is that people who look at the risk-aware consensual kink model also acknowledge that sometimes people like to play under the influence, whether it's alcohol or perhaps the influence of something else, which can actually change their mindset. It can change their tolerances, and it can actually, in many cases, playing under the influence makes things significantly more dangerous, because people's reaction times are just slowed down. So risk-aware consensual kink sort of allows for that conversation to happen, because you're talking about, like, how aware are you of the risks of what you're doing, and are you okay with those risks, and what level of risk are you okay with. So it's a little bit more for specific activities, less for consent in general, but you kind of get the idea. No questions so far about anything I've said? Nobody wants to chime in with anything about that? No? Okay, well, I'll just keep going. So we talked about BDSM, we talked about playing hard to get, and we've defined what consent is, which is, I think, all pretty important parts of the conversation. The other major point that I kind of really want to touch on in regards to consent is that it's a really, how much we use it and how comfortable we are really depends on how much we practice. The more we talk about consent and the more we learn about it, the more comfortable that we're really going to get using it. A lot of people say that, consent feels really awkward, and things feeling awkward, as much as it may be an uncomfortable feeling, things feeling awkward is actually kind of good in a way, because it's signaling to us, that awkwardness that we feel is signaling that this is unfamiliar territory. It's uncovered ground. It's something that puts us out of our comfort zone. And this means that we are we get the chance to develop new skills. So, if asking or talking about consent feels awkward, my challenge to you is that you should really practice it. Talk to your friends, talk to your partner if you have one. Open up conversations with your family about consent. There's lots of different ways you can talk to people about consent. If you have children or if you have nieces and nephews, talk to them about it. Kids actually understand consent better than most adults do. It's funny because it's something they're sort of taught about a lot more, something we learn a lot more as kids. And then as we grow older, for some reason that message gets lost when it comes to romantic relationships, and we start internalizing all these cultural stereotypes for how people should act. So anyway, but yeah, kids understand consent great, and it's all about bodily autonomy too, right? So challenge yourself, talk to people about it. If you don't want to talk to somebody about it, talk to yourself about it. Have a conversation with yourself about consent. Practice. Even if it's in front of the mirror, even if it's when you're driving, or maybe going for a jog, or taking a bike ride, or whatever you're doing, or maybe you're just sitting watching TV, who cares? Practice the phrasing, get it comfortable, The more you practice, the easier it's going to become, the less awkward it's going to feel, right? We shouldn't avoid doing things that are good for us just because they may feel a little awkward, especially when they're good for everybody else too. And the more we normalize that, and the more that we stop thinking about it like a big deal, then it sort of stops becoming a big deal, if that makes sense. It's no longer this big scary thing, And the important thing too is, some people say, like particularly young men, young heterosexual cisgendered men, say that, they're concerned, like there's so much pressure for young men to be sexually active, to be having lots of partners, to be out there and hooking up with people, and it's all part of this prestige thing. And one of the biggest things that young men say when they're like, oh, I feel awkward about asking about consent, is because they're afraid of hearing that no. And there's nothing wrong with hearing no. Nothing wrong with hearing no. It happens. Not everybody's going to be a great fit, and hearing no and being rejected, while it may not feel fun for us, handling rejection with grace is not always easy, or it's not easy, but it's something that, can make actually help in other situations. Mostly because if you ask somebody about sexual activity and they say no, and you make a big deal about it, that sort of says a certain thing about how you are as a person versus, somebody says no and you're like, oh, okay, cool, thanks, just wanted to ask, and you move on. The person that rejected you is going to feel a little bit more comfortable around you. And I know some people would be like, well, why do I care about what this person who just rejected me thinks? Why should I care about how they're feeling or what they think about me? And you should care, because stuff like that gets passed around, particularly among young women. Young women have to watch out a lot more for their safety. And girls talk, if somebody handles rejection really badly, girls talk about that. And it means that you're going to get a certain reputation for things, right? And the other reason you should care too is that just because somebody doesn't necessarily want to have sex with you right now doesn't mean that they may not want to have sex with you in the future. Right? Consent is not a one time, this is the only time we talk about it and it stands for all time, yes or no, right? Things change. Things change all the time. People can change their minds, and that's okay. And if you get rejected and you throw a big temper tantrum, regardless of what gender you are, if you throw a big temper tantrum and you make a big show of being rejected, I can pretty much guarantee that the person that rejected you is like, whew, dodged a bullet there, definitely shouldn't have said yes, thank God I said no. And so it's about future potential. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to make a big thing about rejection. You can just be cool about it, because like I said, consent is definitely not this stands for all time. I say yes or no and it's yes or no for all time, right? That goes back to that, reversible or withdrawn piece. People can change their minds. That's okay. We're allowed to do that, So let's set ourselves up for future success. And you know what? Maybe somebody will never decide that they want to sleep with you. That's okay. But you know what? You may end up getting a really great friend out of it. And you may never be friends if, they feel that you handled their rejection badly. Pardon me. I'm just checking to see if we have any questions or thoughts about any of that, but it does not appear so at this time. Pretty quiet bunch today, and that's okay. So we don't have too much time left today. I did sort of talk about most of the consent stuff that I kind of wanted to cover. I'm just sort of thinking if there's any other major points that I wanted to talk about when it comes to consent. If you do want to learn more about consent, I have so much stuff on my website. I actually do a little animated series as well on YouTube called Consent Made Simple, where I actually go through and each segment is like less than a minute because I wanted to be nice and short and punchy. But they just sort of represent different scenarios, where people ask for consent and different ways people ask for consent and then how they react to it. And it's sort of providing some positive models, because like I said, we don't have a lot of those in the media for how consent should actually be handled, which makes it lots and very confusing for people. So, if you want to learn more about consent, definitely check those out. Check out my articles on my website. I have a whole bunch of them, I don't remember how many, but quite a few. And I also have some consent games and quizzes, so you can test yourself on your consent knowledge and have some fun doing it. So, that's great. And of course, my book, of course. I have a wonderful book. It's fantastic. And actually, a lot of people have said that they wish my book was taught in universities, which I take as a very high personal compliment. But yeah, so you can check that out. I've got digital and hard copies if you want to learn more. I can't think of any other major points I wanted to cover, so I'm just going to wait a few moments and see if there's any more comments or if anybody wants to call in with some thoughts about anything I've said about consent today. Or maybe if they have a story they'd like to share about consent or some consent tips that they want to share with someone else. Tips are good. We like tips. If I have any other short consent tips. We have lots of consent tips, but I think I've covered a good portion of them. Okay. So I guess no questions, no comments coming in. That's all right. The only other thing I can think about in terms of... Oh, actually, you know what? I did think about something else. Something I was going to mention earlier, and then I totally forgot, so let's go back to it. I want to talk briefly about false accusations. Now, I could probably talk a whole hour about false accusations, so I'll see if I can condense this into the next 10-ish minutes. A lot of people voice concerns about false accusations. And it's something that I talk to people quite a bit about. And the funny thing is about false accusations is that they actually only make up about... I mean, it's hard to say because accurate numbers are never really accurate numbers. Briefly, because we don't have accurate numbers of actual assaults. We don't have accurate numbers of things are just never reported accurately to the police. And the other thing too is that a lot of police units aren't actually properly trained. There is actual training that officers or investigators can go through that actually makes finding false accusations really easy. I could talk quite a lot about that, but I won't today. But the problem is that because sexual assault is not a highly funded area for your police departments and investigations, a lot of precincts and a lot of cities don't have enough resources to either train their officers or have enough officers to properly investigate. So all of these things impact the numbers. But that being said, research indicates that it's an estimated, on the high side, 10%. So 10% or less of all sexual assault claims are thought to be false accusations. And as I mentioned, for someone who's been properly trained, it's actually fairly simple or fairly easy to get to the bottom of whether or not it's a false accusation. The reason for that being is that because people are actually so, ironically, people are so uneducated about sex and sexual encounters, and there's so many misconceptions about rape and sexual assault and sexual predators, and all of this misinformation ironically makes it kind of easier to spot false stories. There's certain things that investigators look for that are often missing in false accusations. And so I know that people, when they're talking about, when we talk about sexual assault, there's always somebody that pipes up oh, false accusations, false accusations. There are a lot more people being assaulted than there are people being falsely accused. And I think that for anybody who's worried about false accusations, literally the best thing you can do, the best thing, is to learn and practice consent. And really practice it. Like, follow those guidelines, follow those best practices. You know, don't deviate from them. Like, really work consent. And if you do, there is practically no chance of false accusations. I mean, not to say that it couldn't happen, but if they did, you know, people who worry about false accusations really worry about, you know, people's lives being ruined and people's careers being ruined and so on and so forth. But realistically, false accusations are actually dismissed pretty easily when proper investigation is done. And like I said, you know, if you're really that worried about it, one of the best thing you can do is to learn about consent and to practice it, and to encourage other people to practice it as much as possible. That's all I'm going to say about that. Mostly because, like I said, I could talk a whole hour, and maybe I will. Maybe next week we'll dive more into sexual assault and all of that stuff, but not today. All right, well, I don't see any more questions popping up, and nobody has called in, so I'm going to move into my final thoughts for the day. So, we will be back live, or when I say we, I will be back live tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel, on Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube, for tomorrow, May 20th at 8 p.m. Pacific time or 11 p.m. Eastern time. So please tune in. Please share. You know, this podcast is all about helping people connect with their sexuality, with their relationships. People who need help or advice can get, you know, free one-to-one coaching, personalized. Where else can you get that, right? So, you know, share. You don't know who needs it. Share because people can learn a lot, and share because, you know, we can build a better community where all of us can get a little something out of it. If you are looking for more, I have so much stuff on my website. There's a lot of articles that are up for free, ranging in all kinds of topics relating to sex and sexuality. I'm publishing new stuff all the time. If you're really looking for lots more, please check out our Sexy Hero Society. It is a paid membership where every month I give you access to, you know, new sex positions, new games, relationship challenges. I summarize. I have a podcast series that's available to Sexy Heroes that summarizes research. So every podcast I summarize one research paper regarding or related to sex and sexuality or relationships. So you get to get up to date on current research. Like I said, relationship challenges, games, you know, sex positions. I have like adult cartoons on there that are hilarious. Anyway, so there's lots of stuff on there. Please check it out. The proceeds, it's $20 a month, and the proceeds go towards funding more sex ed and also supporting some classes that I teach for younger kids. So thank you guys so much for tuning in and joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation about consent. As I mentioned a couple times through this call, tomorrow we're going to talk about hookup culture and a little bit about how I think it's going to be impacted by COVID. So yeah, thank you guys so much again, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, one last thing. I'm going to be releasing recordings of these to Podbean, which is going to go into Spotify and hopefully iTunes. I'm still figuring that out. Anyway, so if you just want to listen to these after the fact as well, you can check them out there and on my website as well. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good night.